Hello and welcome to the 5th Labour Leave podcast. My name is David Price, and in the studio with me here is the Right Honourable Gisela Stuart, until recently the Member of Parliament for Birmingham Edgbaston. Gisela is something of a rock star in Labour circles and has been an ardent critic of the EU for many years, despite having been born in Germany. Hello, Gisela.
Hello, David.
And we're also very pleased to welcome David Goodhart, who is head of the Demography, Immigration and Integration Unit at the think tank Policy Exchange. He's also the author of the book, The Road to Somewhere, The Populist Revolt and the Future of Politics. Hello, David.
Hi.
This week we are talking about immigration and the changes in society that led to the historic vote to leave the EU last year, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. First, we're going to start with Gisela, and we want to be clear on this. With the apparent climb downs on Ireland recently, the £50 billion and the ECJ, are you confident that this government can deliver a Brexit in line with what the British public voted for?
I wouldn't be too confident in my expression of confidence, except that I think the British public have a clear expectation of what they want their government to deliver. And should we fail in doing so, I think you would spark a serious undermining of your democratic institutions. And some of the problems which we experience in the House of Commons is also a reflection of how traditional party divides, I think, are kind of breaking down. But coming back to your opening statements, and I know people shouldn't do this, but you say apparent and climb down. First of all, this is kind of a game of three-dimensional chess. And having once spent 15 months of my life negotiating across Whitehall and 27 EU countries, and I thought I had a deal, and then in the last 72 hours, everything unraveled. I'm afraid I still have the scars on my back of that statement, which is oft repeated, but never really properly listened to, which is nothing is agreed until everything's agreed. And people like me have been always clear that, you met your obligations. So paying something as part of the leaving process. I also never had a problem with a transition period, provided you knew what you were transiting to with a clear framework. But the ECJ, for me, is pretty much a red line. If you continue after to give the European Court of Justice a supreme authority over English and British lawmaking, then you have not left.
David.
I think that Theresa May is actually doing quite a good job, despite appearances. Of course, we voted narrowly to leave the European Union. I was actually a Remain voter, although I'm not unhappy with Brexit. But of course, we didn't vote for any particular form of Brexit. And I think where the government can perhaps be criticised is for launching into Article 50 before there was a little bit more of a consensus in the Conservative Party, in the government, indeed perhaps in the country as a whole. That the latter may be a bit too much to ask for, but I think they launched into it without any sort of agreement on what Brexit actually meant, and so they've been in the kind of odd position of having this semi-public debate about what kind of Brexit the country wants, in relation to the cabinet, in relation to the Conservative Party, in relation to Parliament, in relation to the whole country, while also negotiating the thing. And I think considering that, she's actually made remarkable progress, at least for this stage, in that, who would have believed a year ago that she's got most of the Tory Remain MPs have agreed, it seems, to leaving the single market and leaving the customs union without too much of a fuss. And most of the Leave Tory MPs seem to have agreed to, a rather larger leaving fee than perhaps they would have wanted to pay initially. Perhaps some role for the ECJ in, kind of some of these European Euroatom and various things like that. At least some residual role for the ECJ, even if, as as Gisela says, not a significant one, and some sort of agreement, albeit there's a hiatus in the process at the moment, but some sort of a temporary provisional agreement anyway to move forward on Ireland. Now, I mean, that is a remarkable achievement. I was just at a meeting this morning. Stephen Kinnock was there, giving a very kind of eloquent, standard critique of what a complete mess the situation is, and how the government has never had a proper sort of narrative to move us forward. Well, it's partly because they don't have a narrative. I mean, this kind of conventional wisdom, everybody has to have a narrative. It's precisely because she's benefited from constructive ambiguity, which is how she's got to the position, albeit with this slight hiccup, that we are about to move forward to the next stage to talk about trade, but probably to extend the transitional period for another 2 years or whatever it is, which seems to be roughly what the country wants. We are going to get out, but we're going to do it, carefully.
It's not completely out of character. I mean, she benefited from constructive ambiguity, I think, becoming the Prime Minister, didn't she, in the leadership election? Seems to be something of a hallmark of her. But, I mean, surely there have been clear points where, during the referendum campaign, it was spelt out that vote leave means taking back control. It means not being subject to the European Court of Justice. Presumably, not being subject to the ECJ is it's a binary, isn't it? And surely that has to be a red line. And obviously, if from that follows no customs union and no single market.
Yeah, I mean, we're going through this period where you have a significant body and it's probably most significant inside the M25 ring, who essentially have changed tactics. They still deeply, deeply regret, if not, still wake up in the morning sobbing their pillows wet, wondering how on earth we ended up with a leave vote. Now feel that you can't really argue for a second referendum on the basis of what will be the question. You're not going to go to the public and say, "Are you quite sure?" Because they know what they will get is probably a more significant majority. Because the David Goodharts of this world, who were Remainers but are now okay with the outcome, is actually much larger than you'd think. But so the new tactics is to say, yes, we respect the outcome, and then argue for what the deal should be. And I think if you go back to the three principles over which we wanted to take back control, which were the laws, hence the ECJ can't have automatic superiority, but that you could do something with Euratom, but let's get a bit technical, but you can do something. You take back control over your borders, which means not just that you can ask people to show their passport, which is what a lot of the Remainers were saying, well, we've already got control over the border. They said, no, we don't have control. So you can't have the single market with freedom of movement. And the third one is over your trade. And to me, the key was you break the automaticity of contributions to the European Union. And if those three things have been met, then to me, we have left.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good description of what leaving means. And I think even though, I mean, there were two leave campaigns after all, and they had very different sort of mood music and very different atmosphere about them, I think probably most people in both of the groups, the leave groups, would have signed up to that. And there is there was a narrow majority in the referendum. There were 400 plus MPs voted, that confirmed the vote to leave. We had a general election in which 80% of people voted for political parties that were committed to leaving, albeit not necessarily in quite the way in the Labour Party's case, not quite in the clear way that Gisela just described it. But I mean, we are clearly going to leave, and broadly along the lines that you just described, I think.
Can I pick you up on something? Because you say it was a narrow majority. You know, my nightmare scenario was a Welsh referendum scenario. The last Welsh referendum had a turnout of just over 50%, and the winning margin was 0.7%. That was my nightmare. And yet, curiously, nobody is questioning the Welsh referendum outcome. Nobody is actually challenging any of the previous referenda outcome. But with this one, which had a turnout of 72%, which is a pretty respectable turnout, and a 3.8% margin, which, given that over 70 MPs sit in the House of Commons with a winning margin below 3.8%. And nobody says, well, of course, you're not really properly elected MPs. You know,
That's a good point,
MPs go in, and if my majority is 2, then I've still won. And yet we are still rerunning the referendum.
Well, so the attempt to delegitimise it has been based more on the arguments used, which are said to have been fallacious, and obviously the famous 350 million
and the punishment budget.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, both sides used, exaggerated arguments. That's what happens in a adversarial political system. People, indeed, any political system, people use arguments to try and win their cause, and they often turn out to be exaggerations. £350 million a week was clearly, it was a gross figure, etc., etc. But there was at least a debate about it at the time. I remember it.
Exactly. I mean, this was the thing. If we had said 400 million, it would have been an untruth. Actually, you're right, 350 million was not accurate. It should have been 372 million. But, 350, and then you have a debate, and then people say it's a gross figure and net. And yet, when the Financial Times was recently running the 100 billion exit bill figure, I actually was that evening at a dinner at the German embassy with the editor of the FT, and I said to him, is that a gross or a net figure? And he said, well, it's a gross figure. I said, well, so the 350 million on the bus were right after all. And so he didn't talk to me for the rest of the evening.
But you also have this. You have this argument now from the. Obviously, there are a lot of very unhappy Remain people in this country. They are disproportionately influential in certain parts of the media. The Evening Standard, the centre-left media, or the business media in particular. They have a very loud voice, and recently the theme has been capitulation to a set of agreements that they have been supporting all along. I mean, they're sort of crying capitulation to something that they have wanted Theresa May to sign up to a year ago. It just seems.
There's a little bit baffling that was, because they were, had Theresa May not capitulated, then they would have been screaming blue murder, wouldn't they? Yeah, and saying, you've wasted a great opportunity to wrap this up, and, you're just a political ideologue and a zealot. But she did, to use that loaded phrase, capitulate, and she's being criticised for the exact opposite of that. So it's almost like they're sort of being a professional opposition, aren't they, rather than holding a consistent logical point.
It's been pretty clear all along that there is a deal that we can do, and we almost certainly will do, which is kind of Canada plus. I mean, I don't understand all the technicalities, and we will continue I think there'll be a much more continuity in many areas, including in the immigration field, albeit, of course, we will end freedom of movement, but we will continue to have a lot of highly skilled people from the EU coming here and so on. I think there is and we will continue to pay into lots of EU organisations. We will continue to have, in effect, a kind of an associate membership, but we will have sovereignty back in all the things that Gisela mentioned that matter.
Do you think that the voice of the Remain side has been disproportionately loud? So it seems that there was a collective outburst of grief and of misery from a great many people who voted Remain after the referendum. And something that you say, David, in your recent book, people were walking around saying, I feel like I'm living in a foreign country. I've never felt like this before. It's terrible. And you point out that according to various research, a great many people, I think 2/3 of British people, readily say to to pollsters and to researchers that they already feel like they're living in a foreign country.
I mean, it's admittedly a very leading question, but it's been asked, or something like this has been asked several times by different pollsters. That it goes something like this: that Britain has changed a lot in recent years. Some people say that it now feels like living in a foreign country. Do you agree? No, and an extraordinary, frighteningly large numbers of people, about 2/3, 63% of the population, agree to that, which is why I say, the people the Remainers who briefly felt like they were living in a foreign country, well, welcome to the experience that apparently, more than half of their fellow citizens feel every blinking day, not just on June the 24th, 2016. And I think there's been an extraordinary lack. I mean, particularly puzzling from people who regard themselves on the left, an extraordinary lack of empathy and no attempt at all to understand, no emotional intelligence, no attempt to understand the people that I call the people who see the world from somewhere, the category I use in my book, the people who have a very different worldview from the metropolitan Remainers, but they value stability, secure borders, they prefer, they put national citizen rights before more universal rights. They want decent chances for their kids who, on the whole, are not going to university. More of a focus on technical and vocational education and decent apprenticeships and all that. Many of these people voted to leave the European Union, and it was partly because of sort of domestic. A feeling that nationally, domestically, their interests were not reflected by any of the parties, including, most tragically in some ways, the Labour Party, which had traditionally represented such people. But the Labour Party had increasingly in recent decades been taken over by liberal-minded graduates who have a perfectly legitimate worldview of their own, but it happens to conflict in certain fundamental ways with the people that they have historically represented.
These are people you call anywhere.
Yeah, the people who see the world from anywhere, who tend to be highly educated and mobile. That's a particularly important thing in Britain. I think if we could go back and change one small policy that was laid down in the early 1960s, it was when we started to really expand the higher education system in the Robbins Report in the early 1960s, and we introduced residential universities. It's been I think the degree of separation between these value groups that we saw after the Brexit vote was particularly sharp, I think, and would have been less sharp, I think, in many other places, even in America or Germany, because successful people do not leave home at the age of 18 and go somewhere else, which is almost always the story in this country. Yeah. So the people with more or less successful professional lives are invariably people who have left home and their networks and friendship groups are completely different from the ones they had when they were young. And you saw that kind of mutual incomprehension. Hardly any Remainers knew anybody who had voted for Brexit, and vice versa. And that would have been true in many countries to some extent, but I think it's particularly sharp divide here.
And do you think that's one of the reasons why so many Remainers, so many anywheres, were so shocked on such a dramatic and deep level with the referendum result? Because I've got many of my friends are Remainers and many are Leavers, and all the Leavers were saying Leave is bound to win. There's absolutely no way that Leave cannot win. And the Remainers were saying the same to me, with me being a sort of, But
I suspect that your Leaver friends are people who had roots outside London.
Absolutely.
Whereas most of your Remainers were people who only lived in London or perhaps in another metropolitan
Absolutely.
centre.
And my Leaver friends were generally somewheres and my Remainer friends were generally anywheres. Yeah. And people actually live a dual life, especially anywheres. They have their anywhere existence, but they do have a home where at least they're where their parents live or where they grew up, that they sometimes come back to, don't they? But so
I think they've also, to be fair to the anywheres, they're not completely rootless. They have made new homes, but they're often not the places they came from originally. Indeed, we saw the power of, Edgbaston is probably, those places that we saw in the 2017 election, more overtly than previously, the kind of the power of these anywhere places, these anywhere constituencies. Essentially university towns, or university sectors of metropolitan of big cities. When I was young, we talked about university seats. We meant Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, now about 20-25% of all the constituencies in the country have a significant element of higher education presence in them, and that's not just the students and staff of a higher education institution. It's also, at least in the more salubrious places, it's also the mainly liberal-minded graduates who've stayed behind and have made homes there. The Bristols and the Brightons and the Edgbastons and the Manchester Wythenshawe and all of those places,
and a great many constituencies in London as well, of course.
Yeah. And these are sort of anywheres have made them there somewhere places anyway.
Yeah.
Coming back to that, why was there such an outrage after the results? I mean, I still find, particularly if I go, say, do some work, do a lecture at the university or give a talk, and people will come up and it's as if they were revealing a secret. Think, well, I haven't told my friends, but I voted to leave. And the recent, I gave a talk, and this guy came up afterwards, absolutely outraged, and he said, what I really resented about your talk is because that you presented your arguments in such a way that I could not disagree with you, but you are wrong, and then stormed off. And I thought this just about summed up, and I thought it was Brian Eno, of all people, after the referendum, who in one quote sort of said, we all grew up thinking when there's going to be a revolution, it's going to be us who make the revolution. He said, and you know what, in this referendum, all these people who we thought who were really quite thick and up north, and they had the revolution and we weren't there. And there is this bit that they didn't see it coming. And I think that there are problems which we've got in this country. There is a reason why productivity isn't going up. It is because of that skills gap. It is because for too long we've managed to patch up things by immigration. So if you just look at this stage, you've got extra money for the health service. We know we need extra nurses. It's fine to do a short-term solution, which sort of brings in from abroad, but you should increase your training places. We cut training places, we cut bursaries, and then you begin to wonder why people think there's something wrong. So I think the universities, in a sense, the attitude of those who are under 35 is very different to the rest. But David, you've said something which I thought the other day when I listened to Justine Greening, when she said, I grew up in Rotherham, and of course, in the context of social mobility, and I made my way in the world. And I thought there is still this total assumption that to make your way in the world means leaving home.
I cite this speech quite a lot now. I mean, it was an extraordinary speech. She says in this speech, I come from Rotherham, and when I was there, I used to dream of owning my own home, having a well-paid, challenging career, and I knew I couldn't have those things in Rotherham. It is just extraordinary. I mean, we should, in a way, thank her for the kind of openness with which she said this shocking thing about our country. I mean, Rotherham is a town of 120,000 people. It's not a one-horse town, and it's half an hour commute from Sheffield. I mean, the whole area is a kind of, getting on for 1 million people live in that area. The idea that you cannot have an achieved upper professional career in that place. And I compare that to Germany. I mean, if she came from Gelsenkirchen or Essen, she would have gone to the local technical university. I mean, she might have ended up a high flyer in Berlin, but she could have had and could have, a decent, successful life, in that comparable area, or sort of post-industrial, rather depressed area relative to some other parts of Germany, and there would be no question that to succeed you had to leave. I mean, and the kind of Remainer anywheres are simply not addressing these sorts of questions. Alan Milburn doesn't begin to address these questions. He's now left this, gone off in a great huff. Well, I mean, I think this is getting onto another subject. I mean, I think the Social Mobility Commission have done some quite good things, particularly in the area. I mean, they're very bad actually at making sort of proper analytical distinctions. I mean, social mobility is an incredibly complicated and slippery things, and so many things get sort of mixed up in it. But I mean, one of the things that they have done quite well, I think, is focusing on this business of kind of entry into the elite. But that is only one aspect of social mobility. So the concentration on on unpaid internships, obviously grossly unfair. There are 70 or 80,000 unpaid internships in Britain. Most of them will be taken by children who are already very privileged, and it's ridiculous. And we should do something about that, obviously. And it's good that they highlighted that and some of the. But when it comes to the real issue of social mobility is about, essentially, it's the same thing about making the economy work better, is raising the general level of competence in the society.
And if we then need to address some of the problems which I think have led to the disillusionment, is, you have a target of 50% university participation. So the relationship of the state to those who are paying back the tuition fees is a different one. But then you should look at what I think the real scandal is, how much money we spend on 16 to 21-year-olds on vocational training who are not going to university, who after all are 50% of the population. And we have a position now where for the middle classes to vote in their self-interest is virtuous and acceptable. And when you then find that actually everybody at the end of the day starts with their self-interest, and I think that is perfectly legitimate. And if that goes in a different way, there's a kind of outrage of saying you didn't know what you were doing, you were too stupid to realize it, and that's still the argument. And they assume that this is only economic motivation. It is a much, much deeper motivation, which has led to that outcome.
I think that's a great point. It's okay for one set of people to vote in a way that benefits them, but it's not okay for another set. And it just so happens to divide up, as far as a great many people in the media are concerned, that it's fine for Remainers to be self-serving, but not for Leavers, because then they're stupid and greedy and childish and all the rest of it. But I think that there's a real issue for the Labour Party here and for Labour policy makers. So 70% of Labour constituencies voted Leave, and some of the greatest concentrations of the Leave vote were amongst traditional working class Labour voters. How can the Labour Party deal with this, considering such a great fissure in between different parts of the party on this?
I think both political parties have got a problem when they look at the future, but for Labour in particular, the referendum crystallised in a very stark and undeniable way a split. And it may well be that in 10, 20 years, the Labour Party post-Corbyn is like the American Democrats, that it becomes a very middle-class public sector, rights-based, with cities. I'm not sure where that leaves then large swathe of the traditional Labour Party. But if you look at the 2017 results, it's interesting that if you were a Labour MP in an area where you had significant numbers of public sector workers, you had a significant section of ethnic minority votes, and a university, you were fine. If you were in a seat like
Mansfield.
When you had none of these, then your Labour vote really went away, because we went, and it was the failure on such things as when John Mann, my colleague, was using that example of saying that if he had Sports Direct in the constituency, and when he said, when you had a system where jobs were going and they were only advertised in Poland, and you weren't even locally advertising it, and then suddenly your local population found that jobs were created, jobs were taken, they didn't have a chance in there. And when they complained, we told them, you're racist. That was not talking to your core. A colleague of mine went out and he did some timing with Labour canvassers on the doorstep. And he said it was quite extraordinary that if on the doorstep they mentioned the word immigration, on average, it took no longer than 45 seconds for the person who started the conversation to interrupt them and tell them they were racist. So we did not address the issues. We did not even allow a discussion. And that's combined with, I think the rise of UKIP had something to do with unfinished devolution in England outside London. That there were whole swathes of England which weren't sure about its democratic structures. And that could lead to a serious realignment. And I think we've seen the beginning of the realignment in Scotland, because the 2017 election in Scotland fell between nationalists, SNP, and unionists, of which the Conservative and Unionist Party was the greatest beneficiary. And so the next few years, I think, are going to be quite interesting in terms of how that plays out. But the one thing which I don't think is an option is actually business as usual.
No, it's true. I mean, and this is part of this broader shift in politics from a politics that is primarily socioeconomic, in which the basic unit is social class, and the issues are size of the state, equality, inequality, levels of public spending, and so on, to sociocultural politics, where the issues are to do with security and identity, and indeed a reaction, and issues like immigration obviously feature very largely, and European Union membership used to. And these issues haven't emerged just because of sort of, charismatic populists like Nigel Farage. They've emerged because Britain has become so much more open, both economically and socially and culturally, in the last 2 generations. It's transformed many places, often against the wishes of the people who live in them. And the people who live nearby, who perhaps haven't been transformed, see what has happened. So these things. People say the whole time. I mean, liberal Remainers will say the whole time. But why are they complaining in Barnsley? There isn't any immigration in Barnsley. I mean, it's like saying, why are they concerned about 9/11 in San Francisco? It happened in New York, didn't it? I mean, people actually think about their whole country. And they have they often have quite an idealistic view. Indeed, quite contrary to what you were saying about voting in your interest. A lot of Leavers, I think, knew perfectly well they may not be voting in their immediate economic interest, but economics is not what it is all about. As one of the headlines after Brexit had it, meaning, not money. Now, when relatively affluent Guardian reading professionals vote Labour against their immediate economic interest, that is considered something to be celebrated. They're being altruistic, and good for them, they are. But when Sunderland lady, votes to leave the European Union, jeopardising the Nissan plant perhaps in Sunderland, that is just considered dumb, and stupid, often by the same people who are voting against their immediate economic interest when they vote Labour.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you make my point for me in a way, indirectly, that many people regarded their economic interest as a sideline, that they saw that their somewhere interest, their somewhere identity was what defined the reason to vote Leave, wasn't it? And so it shows that the somewheres have a deeply embedded sense of place and a deeply embedded sense of culture and of nation. And of course that, many Remainers would say, oh, that's extreme, that's nationalist and all the rest of it. But perhaps we should be bringing in this distinction between nationalism and nationalism. A lot of somewhere people believe in the idea of nation states, don't they? And that nation states exist for a good reason. And that does not make you a sort of, Union Jack wearing bother-booted football hooligan, does it?
No, most people, not just somewheres, believe in the importance of national social contracts. That your country, the better off people in the country, whoever it is, kind of owe an allegiance to their fellow citizens before more universalist or even sort of European impulses, and a lot of people, I think, voted Leave because they felt that those national social contracts in employment, as Gisela said, I mean, and I've come across this too. I mean, whole distribution centres outside Nottingham that have only Polish people in them, or only people from other East European countries. Absolutely scandalous, and that is felt as a breaking of a national social contract in the labour market, or in the welfare state. The fact that people could come here from any other European country and immediately, within 3 weeks or 3 months or whatever it was, that they could qualify for the entire range of social rights that the British citizens are also entitled to. So you had competition for social housing with people who you didn't feel were kind of legitimate competitors in a way. I mean, surely I'm a British citizen. Shouldn't I come first here? And I think that is common sense. Of course, much of the kind of liberal establishment, you remember Gordon Brown's famous speech, British jobs for British workers, and it was kind of greeted with outrage. But I mean, 20 years before, it would have been he wouldn't have said it because it would have been considered so banal. We've made this sort of extraordinary change in that relatively short period of time.
And just to add to that, in a sense, the United Kingdom, you already have a supranational identity to be British. So someone like me who was born in Germany, I would never say I'm English, but I very easily can say British. So the sort of the dark underbelly of the darker side of nationalism, which is excluding others, I think the British in many ways had overcome it. Then you get to the point of too much when you've got these masses, too big a movement of labour, which is usually the young. It's not very good for the host country either. There's a certain level which is fine because we've always had that kind of movement. And then if it's in numbers which you can't plan for, then you have a problem. It takes time to provide the school places and all those things. And these are legitimate, neutral debates, which the politicians should have had. If, now with hindsight, even the Labour politicians say in 2004, we should have insisted on transition periods. But with that acknowledgement that that's what they should have done, they don't finish the argument by saying, because it didn't allow us to do those things.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic debate, and more of which later, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Price, and I'd like to thank Gisela Stuart and David Goodhart. Thank you both.